I didn't believe in the sound at first. That's the honest truth. When you grow up around old houses, you learn quickly that wood has a language of its own. It shrinks, expands, complains when the weather shifts. Floors speak at night. Walls sigh. None of it means anything, or at least that's what you tell yourself, because the believing otherwise would mean admitting that structures remembered the people inside them. The house in Tedworth had been quiet for years before I arrived, not abandoned, not derelict, just settled. The kind of place that feels finished with its history. Low ceilings, thick beams, a modest colonial footprint adopted from something older, something imported, and rerouted when the Atlantic still felt endless. I was there on an errand that had nothing to do with folklore. A property review, documentation, old deeds and newer signatures. The kind of work that puts you alone in rooms long enough for your thoughts to echo back at you. The first sound came while I was reading, not loud, not sudden. A single beat, flat, hollow, controlled. It didn't come from any one direction. That's what caught my attention. Sound usually betrays itself by location, by distance, by echo. This didn't. It existed inside the space, as if the air itself had decided to strike something invisible. I waited. Silence returned, complete and obedient. I told myself it was structural, a pressure shift, a settling joint reacting to the cold. Reasonable explanations line up quickly when you invite them. They want to be chosen. Then it came again. 2 beats this time, evenly, spaced, patient. Not random. I stood slowly, the chair legs barely scraping the floor. The house didn't react. No creaks, no protest. That absence felt deliberate, like the building was holding its breath. I walked the length of the room, listening with my body instead of my ears. That's something you learn without realizing it. When sound doesn't travel normally, you feel for it. Pressure in the chest, tightness behind the eyes, a subtle vibration in the teeth. Nothing, until I reached the center beam. The third beat struck then, closer, not louder, clearer. I froze. My hand hovered inches from the wood, and in that moment I felt something I still struggle to decide without simplifying it. Anticipation, not mine. The house's, or something occupying it with professional patience. The beat came again and again. A rhythm was forming now, measured, intentional, the cadence of something practiced, not improvised. It reminded me, absurdly, of military drills I'd seen as a child, not the chaos of battle, the discipline beforehand, the learning of timing. I stepped back. The sound stopped instantly, not faded, stopped. That was when the weight settled in, that subtle realization that the noise hadn't been happening to the house. It'd been happening with me. I didn't hear it again that evening. I finished my work, packed my papers, locked the door behind me. Outside, the world behaved normally. Wind moved through the trees. A distant engine passed on the road. Everything sounded correct again. But as I walked away, I noticed something that stayed with me longer than the sound itself. My footsteps felt wrong. Not out of rhythm, out of sync, as if the ground beneath me was still listening, waiting for the next beat. I slept poorly that night, not because of fear, but because my body refused to settle. Every time I drifted close to rest, I felt it again, that internal counting, that unconscious measuring of space and time, as if some part of me had been tuned to a rhythm I couldn't hear anymore, but hadn't escaped. The house didn't appear in my dreams. That disturbed me more than if it had. Dreams at least let terror wear a face. This was formless, just pacing. I returned the next morning earlier than necessary. There was no professional reason for it. The paperwork could have waited. But curiosity has a way of disguising itself as responsibility when it needs cooperation. Daylight made the house look smaller, less capable. Sunlight flattened its angles, softened the beams, made the windows seem almost friendly. That illusion didn't survive the moment I stepped inside. The air felt held, not stale, not cold, simply paused, as if the house had been waiting mid-breath since I left. I stood still just inside the threshold and listened. Nothing. No drum, no creak, no ambient noise. Even the faint hum houses usually carry. Plumbing, wind in the walls, insects was absent. The silence wasn't empty, it was restrained. I moved room to room, deliberately, making sure my footsteps were slow, evenly spaced. I didn't know why I did that until later. Some instinct told me irregular movement would be noticed. In the back room, I found the object. It sat against the far wall, half covered in cloth, a small drum, cylindrical, hand-sized, old but not decorative, utilitarian. The wood was darkened by age and oil, worn smooth when hands had gripped it over and over again. There was no skin. The top was open, bare wood rim exposed, no torn remnants, no nails suggesting anything had been removed recently. It had never been finished, or it had been stripped down to what mattered. I touched it. The vibration came instantly. Not sound, sensation. A pulse that traveled up my fingers and into my wrist, sharp and precise like the echo of something that had just struck. I pulled my hand back. The house answered. One beat. Not from the drum, from everywhere. The walls carried it without echo. The floor absorbed it without complaint. The ceiling did not respond at all, as if the sound had never been meant to rise. I understood then what I was dealing with. This wasn't a haunting in the theatrical sense. There was no restless spirit wandering rooms, no trapped presence replaying trauma. This was something installed, something trained. In older traditions, the kind that crossed oceans and changed accents, drums weren't instruments. They were tools, used to mark time, to signal movement, to command attention across distance. This one didn't need a skin. The house was the skin, and somewhere, whether inside the walls or inside memory itself, something was waiting to see if I would answer the rhythm or break it. I didn't take the drum with me. That decision still matters. There was a moment, brief, shamefully human, where I considered it. Removing the object felt like control. Proof that whatever was happening could be boxed, catalogued, explained away later under better lighting. But the thought came with resistance. The kind you feel when you reach for something that does not belong to you and never did. The drum stayed where it was. I left the house again, and once more, the outside world compiled. Sound returned. Birds argued in the hedges. A distant hammer struck wood somewhere down the road, sharp and ordinary. The contrast was unsettling. It made the silence inside feel intentional, curated. That night, the rhythm followed me, not audibly, internally. I became aware of a while brushing my teeth. The skin drip, the scrape of bristles, my own breathing. All of it began aligning around an absent beat. I caught myself pausing between motions, waiting for something to allow me to continue. That was the first adjustment. The second came when I realized the rhythm was changing. Subtly at first, a half beat here, a stretched interval there, like something testing how much it could alter without being noticed, without being rejected. I woke just before dawn with the certainty that I was no longer alone in my thoughts, not watched, accompanied. The rhythm wasn't constant. It surfaced when I made decisions, and I hesitated, and I stood still too long. Later, reviewing old records, I found mention of disturbances that had never been formally acknowledged, complaints written off as livestock agitation, unexplained fatigue, workers quitting without explanation, a pattern of short stays and long absences. No mention of a drummer, but repeated references to timing. Movements fell out of order, workdays shortened themselves, men lost track of the hours without reason. That afternoon, I returned to the house again. I told myself it was for documentation. The truth was simpler. I wanted to see if it would respond differently now that I was aware. It did. The moment I crossed the threshold, the beat returned, softer than before, restrained, as if acknowledging recognition. A courtesy tap, not an invitation. Not yet. I didn't move, neither did the house. The rhythm adjusted again. This time, it matched my heartbeat perfectly. I felt it then, the shift from observation to participation. Whatever had been installed here was no longer content to perform alone. It was calibrating, learning how long I could stand still, how quickly I would breathe, how easily my body surrendered timing to something else. I left without turning my back to the room. Behind me, the drum remained silent, but the house continued the beat, patient and precise, rehearsing a rhythm that now included me, whether I consented or not. The next time I entered the house, I didn't bring papers or tools. I brought time. That sounds insignificant, but it wasn't. Objects can be catalogued, damage can be measured. Time, once offered, becomes participation. The moment I stepped inside without an agenda, the house reacted, not with sound, but with alignment. The air felt denser, tuned, like a room prepared for rehearsal. The beat did not begin immediately. That restraint mattered. I sat on the floor near the central beam, legs crossed, hands resting upon my knees. The position felt wrong and inevitable at the same time. I wasn't performing a ritual. I was submitting to observation. Minutes passed, then one beat, low, internal, more pressure than sound. I didn't flinch. Another beat followed, slightly faster. The house was asking a question. I became aware of a second sensation, not rhythm, but anticipation. The space around me felt forward leaning, as if the walls themselves were waiting for a reply they could recognize. Not words, not movement, something more primitive. My breath caught, just for a moment. The beat responded instantly. This was the exchange, not communication, feedback. I understood then that the drummer was not a figure moving through the rooms. There were no footsteps to follow, no shadow to corner. The presence operated through response. It existed in the space between action and reaction, inhabiting the delay. I shifted my weight. The beat shifted too, faster, sharper. I stood abruptly, breaking the cadence. The house reacted with a tremor that traveled through the floorboards, up the walls, into the beams. Dust fell from the ceiling in fine, controlled lines like punctuation. The drum in the back room answered then, not with sound, with resonance. The open rim vibrated, humming like a throat preparing to speak. I backed away slowly, careful not to trip over the timing again. Every step felt negotiated, allowed only after the beat approved it. When I reached the threshold, the rhythm paused, stretched thin, testing whether I would hesitate. I didn't. The moment I crossed outside, the beat ceased. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was appraisal. Whatever inhabited the house had learned something important, not about the structure, not about sound, about me. And I knew with an uncomfortable clarity that the next exchange won't be initiated by my presence. It would come looking for its answer. I noticed it first in places that had nothing to do with the property. A pause at the end of a sentence that lingered too long, a step that landed half a fraction late. The uncomfortable sensation that I was interrupting something by continuing normally. The rhythm had followed me, not as sound, not as sensation, as structure. I would reach for a cup and stop an inch short, waiting without knowing why. I would turn a corner and hesitate, allowing an invisible measure to complete itself before moving again. It wasn't compulsion, it was accommodation. The worst kind, the kind you agreed without realizing a choice was offered. Sleep became segmented, not in hours, but in intervals. I woke repeatedly with the certainty that I had missed a beat, that something had occurred without my acknowledgement. No dreams, just absence, punctuated by the impression of timing gone wrong. When I returned to the house after several days, the door stood slightly open. That alone should have ended it. Houses do not open themselves in still air, but fear had already been reorganized inside me. I stepped forward instead of back. Inside, the silence was no longer restrained. It was active. The beat did not begin. That was the change. The house no longer needed to announce itself. It had learned that I would supply the rhythm if given enough space. I walked toward the back room. The drum was gone. Not moved, not broken. Removed entirely without trace or disturbance. No marks on the floor, no dust pattern, nothing to suggest it had ever been there. The vibration returned then, spreading outward from the walls instead of inward. The house had inverted its attention. It wasn't performing anymore, it was listening. I realized something cold and undeniable in that moment. The drum had never been the source. It had been an anchor, a translator, something to make the rhythm manageable, external, interpretable. Now it wasn't needed. The beat resumed, faint, deliberate, but it didn't come from the house. It came from me, from the hollow behind my ribs, from the subtle pressure behind my eyes. My pulse no longer matched it. It followed it. I backed toward the door, misjudged the timing, and stumbled. The floor caught me with a dull thud that landed offbeat. The response was immediate. The walls shuddered once, violently as if rejecting the error. A sharp crack ran along the ceiling beam, not from stress, but from correction. I scrambled upright and fled without looking back. Behind me, the house did not scream. It corrected its rhythm, and I understood then that the phantom drummer was no longer confined to wood or beams. It had found a more precise instrument. After that, ordinary movement became difficult, not impossible, just wrong. I would begin walking and feel the urge to stop, not from fatigue or fear, but from misalignment. My body no longer trusted its own timing. Each step carried the faint pressure of correction, as if something invisible was counting for me and finding me inaccurate. I tried to drone it out. Music helped briefly, but only structured music. Anything with an irregular rhythm made my chest tighten, my breathing shallow. I caught myself unconsciously gravitating toward slow, martial tempos, drums, marches, anything predictable enough to lean on. Silence was worse. In silence, the rhythm asserted itself again, subtle and internal, not loud enough to hear, just present enough to organize everything else around it. It became clear that the beat was no longer something imposed, it was installed. I avoided the house for weeks, told colleagues the work was finished, filed reports that felt dishonest but necessary. Distance, I hoped, would cause the phenomena to weaken. Instead, it refined itself. The beat began to anticipate me. I would reach for a doorknob and feel the pause before my hand touched metal. I would inhale and feel resistance, like the breath had been scheduled differently. My heart no longer set the pace. It adjusted to something else's authority. The first physical sign came one night as I stood in the bathroom, staring at my reflection without understanding why. My pulse was visible in my throat, but it wasn't steady. It waited between beats, not irregular, deliberate. That's when I realized the rhythm wasn't simply controlling timing, it was measuring capacity, testing how much deviation a human body could tolerate before correcting itself or being corrected. I tried to break it intentionally. I ran, hard, fast, letting my breath go ragged, my steps chaotic. For a few moments it worked. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, disorder returned. Then the pressure came, not pain, compression, a tightening in my chest, my skull, my joints, as if the space inside me was being reduced to fit a predefined interval. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, every involuntary movement snapping back into place. The rhythm stabilized. Satisfied. I lay there for a long time afterward, trembling, listening to my own body obey something it did not understand. That was when the truth settled fully. The phantom drummer didn't haunt places. It trained bodies, and once the measure was learned, it never needed to strike the drum again.